Well, maybe we'll get started here, and I'll I'll give you a little intro and let you take over.
Sounds good.
All right. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Alyssa Karpinka, and I am the event coordinator for McNally Robinson Booksellers in Saskatoon. We are located on Treaty 6 territory, the traditional lands of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dene, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and Métis Nations. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the virtual launch of The Malevolent Seven by Sebastien de Castell, published by Mobius Books. Thank you so much to Sebastien for being here tonight, and to Amanda Harkness from Mobius for working with us to create this event. You'll notice the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Please use this to ask any questions you may have throughout the presentation, and we will do our best to have Sebastien answer them later on. The Malevolent Seven is an irreverent dark fantasy filled with mercenary mages of dubious moral character who find themselves accidentally caught up in a battle between godlike forces threatening to destroy the mortal realm. Despite their insistence on not being heroes, they're stuck trying to save the world unless someone comes up with a better offer. I'll now tell you a bit about our guest this evening. Sebastien de Castell's acclaimed swashbuckling fantasy series, The Greatcoats, was shortlisted for both the Goodreads Choice Awards for Best Fantasy and the Gemmell Morningstar Award. His YA fantasy series, Spellslinger, was nominated for the Carnegie Medal and is published in more than a dozen languages. Sebastien lives in Vancouver with his lovely wife and their two belligerent cats. He spends his time writing, traveling, and going on strange adventures. I will now turn things over to Sebastien. Please give him a warm welcome telepathically.
Thanks so much. Hi, everybody. I really wish I could be seeing everybody in person because I kind of love doing that. But this is going to be great, too. I just did an event here in Vancouver yesterday where I decided to do the reading from the latest book, Malevolent Seven, where I basically converted the first chapter into a kind of a bizarre little radio drama where I could pass out scripts to the audience and have different people do different things, from different voiced characters to the sounds of horses on a battlefield or soldiers dying or castle walls coming down or magic spells. And it was tremendous fun. Unfortunately, that doesn't work so well over Zoom, so you're stuck with me only, but I'm going to try to do the best reading I can for you from Malevolent Seven. I thought I'd do this we're going to do this in like 4 little beats. So the first one, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I like to think of as the dark origins of Malevolent Seven, and just tell you where the book came from. And then I'm going to read you from the first chapter. And then I'm going to tell you a couple of very strange little magical things that happened as a result of writing this strange magical book. And then we'll do a Q&A. And I absolutely love answering people's questions, no matter what they are. And you should know that the absolute single worst experience for any author at a book event is when they say, "I'll happily take your questions now," and there's nothing. So, you've got some time to make something up, but, for heaven's sakes, please do. So this book, The Malevolent Seven, came from some very strange origins for me. It was February of 2020, which I think most of you will remember was kind of when the pandemic first really hit Canada. We started becoming more aware of it, and we started to have to deal with certain kinds of restrictions. And I notice a lot of authors now will sometimes talk about their COVID book, because that was such a profound and challenging experience for so many people. The thing is that for me, it really wasn't. I'm a novelist by trade, which means I work from home, and most of the time I'm working by myself. I also live in British Columbia, where we didn't have quite as many restrictions in some places. We tend to have warmer weather, so you could go outside more. And so I kind of had a very privileged and easy time of it. And yet I was going through something completely different, because I had recently finished the 6th and final book in the Spellslinger series, which is a young adult fantasy series. And the thing about young adult fantasy is you can have violence, you can even, have sex, but swearing, that's the thing that's going to corrupt the youth of today. And so I actually quite like swearing. I'll try to, limit myself a little bit here, although I can't help the fact that the book is full of swearing. But I was just feeling that pressure. And over the course of the 3 years of the Spellslinger's publication, because it was 6 books and 2 books per year, I got to experience this really strange, gradual kind of confinement of language where more and more words that might be in the manuscript that might have been in book 1 would suddenly be sort of questioned in book 3 or 4. And I just really started to feel this sort of confinement from it. It's not anybody's fault. Language evolves. It's meant to evolve as society evolves. But for me, it was starting to feel a little bit like a couple of iron bars falling down in front of me. But at the same time, there was all of this kind of social media chatter around fantasy and which subgenres were tired and we shouldn't have any more of that, and which tropes were cliched and even problematic, and so we don't want, so writers should stop doing that. And then you've also got publishers telling you, oh, this isn't hot anymore, and oh, this is what everybody's looking for now, or readers of books, sending you these wonderful letters saying, please write more of this, for example. But mostly it was about things like don't do this and don't do that. And I pitched a bunch of different series to a publisher that had asked me, they just kept asking me for another pitch for another series. And every time they'd be like, well, I don't know, people don't like this now. And so I started to feel like there were so many iron bars falling down in front of me that I was suddenly inside this really strange prison cell. And so I needed a way out. And the way out for me was to write what I like to call, well, I call it by another name, but I'm going to temper the name a little bit for this, but you'll figure it out. What I like to call a screw you novel. And a screw you novel is just a book that you just write entirely for yourself that no one else is meant to see. And it's like a middle finger to all the rules and restrictions and opinions that that a writer sort of feels are being put on them. A novel, not for anyone else, just for me. And some people might sort of think, oh, my goodness, like who has time to write a novel just for themselves, not for publication? But keep in mind, I'm a novelist by profession. This is what I do. I'm supposed to be able to write books. And when you make your living writing books, you need to be able to, write them with a reasonable frequency. And so that's what I set out to do. I was going to write a screw you novel. It was going to have a ton of swearing. It was going to have whatever tropes I wanted. It was going to have whatever characters I wanted. And so long as I kept writing just for myself, it wouldn't matter because no one else was going to see this. You may be guessing so far already, but what then ended up happening was I finished it and I felt this tremendous kind of relief. I had done what I wanted to do. But my agent at the time, who I adore, knew what I was doing and asked if she could read the manuscript. And so I said, okay, go ahead. I gave her the manuscript. And much to my surprise, she came back and said, I love this. Let's go sell this to a publisher. And I said, you're completely off base. This is not a book for publication. Nobody's going to want this. There's a million reasons why not. She then retired to go off and do really exciting things at Oxford University, and passed me on to a new agent. He's a lovely guy. We're good friends. And the first thing he did was he asked to read it as well. And then he read it and said he liked this way better than my, young adult squirrel cat books or even some of my swashbuckling books. And he wanted to sell, and I thought there's no way. But as you can imagine, what strangely ended up happening is that a publisher bought it, made it their lead title, which just means that they put a little bit more emphasis into it. And that's why this book is hopefully in your hands. And, when you're buying a copy, I just want everyone to know, don't feel any kind of restriction. You can buy as many copies of this as you want. I recommend 10 as a good starting point. Sorry, I've got to show for my book periodically. But that's how the book came about. But that's not the full story of what happened with Malevolent Seven. But before I tell you about that, let me read to you from the first chapter. And I hope you enjoy this. It always seems strange to me when I'm not right in front of an audience, but I'm going to pretend that you're all here in front of me in my office. And I'm going to assume that you're enthralled and laughing at all my jokes when there are jokes. So this is Malevolent Seven, Chapter 1. Picture a wizard. Go ahead, close your eyes if you need to. There he is, see? Old, skinny guy with the long, scraggly beard. He probably trips over on his way to the bathroom in the middle of the night. No doubt he's wearing some sort of iridescent silk robes that couldn't protect his frail body from a light breeze. The hat's a must too, right? Covered in esoteric symbols that would reveal to every other mage which sources of magic this moron relies on for his powers. You wouldn't want a simple steel helmet or something that might, protect the part of him most needed for conjuring magical forces from being bashed in with a mace or pretty much anything that's a household object heavier than a soup ladle. Yep, behold the mighty wizard, a stoop-backed Phoebe who couldn't run up a long flight of stairs without giving himself a heart attack. Now, open your eyes, and let me show you what a real war mage looks like. Fall, you pasty-faced little fuckers, Corrigan roared as our contingent of wonderists assaulted the high citadel walls our employer had sent us to bring down ahead of his main forces. Fall so that I can rip your hearts out with my bare hands and feed you to my favorite devil as an appetizer before he feasts on your miserable souls. Yeah, Corrigan was a real charmer, all right. Big man, shoulders as broad as any soldier's. I stood maybe a half an inch taller, but in every other dimension he was my superior. The muscles on Corrigan's forearms strained against the bejeweled gold and silver bands he always negotiated into his contracts. Tempestoral mages of his caliber have no particular use for precious metals or gemstones, but when it came to selling his services, Corrigan liked to, in his word, remind those rich arseholes who needs who. Watch this one, Cade, he shouted to me over the tumult of battle all around us. Our employer's foot soldiers and mounted cavalry were fighting and dying to keep the enemy troops busy while we wonderists did the real damage. Corrigan's eyes glowed with the same unnerving indigo as the sparks that danced along the tightly braided curls of his hair and beard. Tendrils of black tempestoral lightning erupted from his calloused and charred palms to sizzle the air and tear at stone and mortar like jagged snakes feeding on a colony of mice. He grinned at me, his white teeth in stark contrast to the ebony of his skin, and then laughed as each of his fists closed around one of his lightning bolts. He began wielding them like whips, grabbing hold of the stalwart defenders atop the walls and sweeping them up into the sky before shaking them until their spines snapped. Several other poor bastards leaped to their deaths rather than waiting for Corrigan to take an interest in them. We don't get paid extra for making them shit their pants, I reminded him, my fingers tracing misfortune sigils in the air so that the volleys of arrows the enemy fired at us missed their targets. Our job is to convince them to surrender, not commit suicide. Our job, the indigo braids of Corrigan's beard rustled with the same enthusiasm his lightning snakes showed as they destroyed in minutes the gleaming high-towered citadel that had taken hardworking masons decades to build. Our job, Cade, is to make what we in the business call an impression. I suppose I couldn't argue with that. Our employer was an ascendant prince, self-declared, of course, who'd been having some difficulty convincing the local ruling archons of his divinely sanctioned rule. Sending a coven of mercenary wonderists to wage mayhem and murder, I never lied to myself by calling it war, wasn't likely to convince anyone of Ascendant Lucian's holiness. But as His Magnificent had explained it to me, get enough of the brave ones and the rest will pay to whoever I tell them. He might be a complete fucking moron, but Lucian was right about that much at least. The crossbowmen atop the walls stopped firing their bolts at us, no doubt tired of watching the wooden shafts splinter against the rocks as the ill-luck spells I'd kept around our division meant each and every one of them missed their mark. Meanwhile, Corrigan and a couple of the others got on with blasting their brethren to pieces with impunity. Corrigan lightened up on his thunderous assault and motioned for a nearby echoist to spin a little sonoral magic to amplify his voice as he called out to the citadel's terrified defenders. There now, my little ducklings, no need to jump. Just open up the gates for Uncle Corrigan and we can all have a nice cup of tea before supper. He glanced back at me. There, happy? You really are a prick, you know that? I took advantage of the momentary distraction amongst the archers to give my fingers a shake while renewing the shield over our squad of 11 wonderists. Corrigan shrugged. What do you expect? I conjure rampant fucking devastation from the tempestoral plane for a living so that one group of assholes can conquer another group of assholes, and then a couple of years later, that second group of assholes hires me to kill off the first lot. That can't be good for the soul. Truer words had never been spoken. Enemy wonderists, one of our comrades shouted. Up on those high walls, the telltale shimmer of auroral magic, that being the nice people kind, appeared. Archon Beleda had finally sent out her own contingent of wonderists to kick our arses. When Corrigan got a look at the silk-robed, gray-bearded scarecrows standing up there, he was pissing himself laughing so hard his tendril spell almost collapsed. "Look," he shouted to the rest of us, "real live auroral mages have come to cast our souls to the pits. Kneel before these noble miracle workers and weep for mercy, for surely the judgment of the Lord Celestine is at hand." The rest of us didn't laugh. We focused on our jobs, which now included sending those dignified old men and women to their graves. It wasn't Archon Beleda's fault her defenders couldn't beat us. They were locals, patriots fighting for a noble cause, while we were mercenaries motivated by greed and lousy upbringings, loyal only to the fees our employer had promised us. The poor bastards never had a chance. One of the enemy wonderists, a silver-haired woman already dripping with nervous sweat, took the lead. Blood seeped from her eyes as she cast a sorceress incantation we in the business call a heart chain, because it pierces right through defensive spells to burst the enemy's blood vessels. It's not the sort of thing any of us would use because it's a conjoined sympathy spell, which means a heart chain also kills the person casting it. I marveled at the old codger's redoubtable courage and sacrifice as the thread-like silver tether stretched across the 200 yards between them to bind her heart to Corrigan's. The big brute's eyes went wide as his fingers clawed at his own chest. He turned to me, but no sound came from his lips as he mouthed my name. Corrigan Blight was a monster, no doubt about it. He killed people for money, and he did it without ever questioning whether such acts could be justified. Anytime I'd asked whether perhaps there was a better way to earn a living, he'd slap me across the head and proudly declared, "Didn't make the rules, don't plan to break them." If you stuck him next to the old lady on the wall and asked 100 people which one of them deserved to live, not one of them would say Corrigan. Well, except me. Corrigan was my friend, which was a hard thing to admit to myself and an even harder thing to find in this profession. He saved my life more times than I'd saved his, and I know that doesn't justify the choice I made in that moment, but maybe it explains why, without giving it a second's thought, I conjured a poetic injustice. Beneath my leather cuirass, a set of 3 intertwining sigils etched into my torso began to smolder. Then the sigils appeared in the air before me, floating scrawls of ebony ink, curves and edges glimmering. I could feel the seconds counting down towards Corrigan's heart, bursting in his chest. He clutched at my shoulder in panic, or maybe searching for a final moment of human connection. I shrugged him off. I needed to concentrate. I placed my right hand above the first sigil, which looked like a distorted stick figure crowned in 7 rays. It represented the enemy spellcaster. When I moved my hand upwards, the sigil followed, and I placed it in a direct line between myself and the auroral mage casting the heart chain. The second sigil, a gleaming black circle with a second smaller half circle overlapping the top of it, looked almost like a padlock. It moved of its own accord, floating silently up to Corrigan's forehead, which would have unnerved him no end if he'd not been too busy dying to notice. The particular forms of magic I work manifest a kind of elementary consciousness within them, which meant that the spell knew Corrigan was the target of the auroral mage's heart-rending invocation. I quickly placed 3 fingers atop the locking sigil, then moved it between me and the enemy wondrist atop the citadel walls, looking for my target. This is where casting a poetic injustice gets tricky. Altering the binding on someone else's spell requires finding someone to whom they already have a strong emotional connection, which would usually require time and research, neither of which we had to spare. But these idiots had made it easy for me. Beside the auroral mage stood a fierce-eyed old gentleman holding her hand. I might not be the world's most sentimental guy, but even I could sense the love between them. I quickly tethered the targeting signal to him. Now for the 3rd sigil. With the thumb and forefinger of each hand, I grasped the 2-headed coiled snake, ignoring the ink-black tongues that flickered menacingly at me, pulled the spiral straight and attached a head to each of the other 2 sigils. The thin silver thread binding the auroral mage to Corrigan snapped away from him, whipping through the air with blinding speed before attaching itself to the old man next to her. Even when he saw the heart chain coming for him, he didn't make a move to abandon her. Maybe he was her husband, and such a cowardly thought never occurred to him. Till death did they part, as no one with a conscience might say. Corrigan painfully sucked air into his lungs, giving me just the barest nod of acknowledgement, then, smiling with smug self-satisfaction, renewed his attack on the walls, with just as much vigor and twice as much pleasure as before. I had to lean against him to keep from collapsing to the ground. Poetic injustice spells are hard on the body and the soul, I guess. In case I hadn't made this clear already, we're not exactly the good guys. But don't worry, by the end of this story, me, Corrigan, and the 5 other wonderists who would come to be known as the Malevolent Seven would definitely be getting what was coming to us. So thank you for that. I hope you enjoyed some of that reading. It's funny, the more I read it, the more challenging it becomes to read, because you start to get it all in the muscles in your brain and then flip out of it. So before we get to the Q&A, where our host will hopefully come back and take charge so that I don't completely screw it up, I thought I'd tell you about some of the odd things that happened as a result of writing this strange, irreverent, magical fantasy book that was supposed to be just for me. Because I think there's some good lessons in the kind of strange experience I had for all of us. And the first was that I discovered that despite that I was so determined to write all of these things that I wanted to write, and I didn't care whether it would offend anybody or what anybody's opinion was, it turns out I don't really want to write most of the things that people say we shouldn't say to each other. It turns out most of those things, there's a good reason why we're trying to sort of evolve and change our language. And in reality, nobody was censoring me. I was just kind of censoring myself. And so that was kind of an interesting thing to discover, which is funny because my wife warns me about this all the time. She's a librarian, so she's very familiar with censorship. And she will often sort of say, when I complain about this kind of thing, she'll say, well, who's actually censoring you? And so in reality, it was me. The second thing I discovered was that when you write a novel, you don't really know what it's about until you hit the end. And the thing that I was writing about, despite having set out to write something full of crazy magic and wild adventure and tons of different magic systems and spells and anti-heroes, was that I wanted to write about something very peculiar about good guys and bad guys. So we live in this time now, I think, where we keep trying to decide who's a good guy and who's a bad guy. And I'm trying to use good guys and bad guys here in a non-gendered way. So I hope it's taken in that spirit. But we keep dividing the world into the good people and bad people. And the definition of a bad guy is someone who does something wrong or has ever done something wrong. And then we sort of decide that's it, you're kind of a bad guy. And a good guy isn't so much someone who does good things, but someone who's never done anything bad. And I realized that I was, just as a human being, I was starting to worry about what happens when we've convinced everybody that we're all just bad guys. And so you'll notice, even right from the first chapter of Malevolent Seven, that Cade is someone who's kind of decided for himself, I guess I'm just one of the bad guys. That's just how it is. So there's no point in me trying to do anything about that. And deciding that we're bad guys is a very effective way of absolving us from the responsibility for helping our fellow human beings, which is not something that's going to work out very well for us, because you know what? The local firefighter might believe things that I find abhorrent. And might feel likewise about me. But when there's a fire, I kind of need that person to step up, regardless of whether they think I'm a bad guy or a good guy. And so what happens in this book is these 7 motley mages with all their brokenness and all their problems start to realize that there's no good guys left. And if they don't step up, who's going to do that? And so when I wrote this book, what I was really doing is bridging the gap between what I was seeing in the world and what I was kind of feeling inside. People often ask novelists, where do you get your ideas from? And we all have our kind of gags that we use to answer that. But the truth for me is, I'm always writing about the gap between what I see out there and what I feel inside. And the beauty of doing that is that when you do it, you create a bridge between what you're experiencing and what you're seeing. It doesn't mean you change your opinions. Sometimes your opinions become even more steadfast. It just means that you start to understand why that gap exists. And so even if nobody had ever bought Malevolent Seven as a book, I would still have gained tremendously from writing it. And the strangest thing of all is I discovered that if I just write a novel for myself, and when I genuinely explore that gap between the outside world and what I feel inside, I end up writing a book that lots of people can enjoy. And so that's the strange origins of Malevolent Seven. And with that, I would be delighted to answer any questions you have. And if you have no questions, don't forget the worst thing an author can go through is have a Q&A and have nobody want to know anything.
Well, you're in luck. We do have a few questions so far. We have got a couple here. First, we have, regarding the rules around YA novels and how constricting they started to feel for you, do you think that adult fantasy has less rules or just different rules? Was it just the swearing, or did you find more freedom overall with the adult demographic?
Well, I think that's a really excellent question. And bringing in the notion of demographic at the end of it is especially prescient, because one of the actual challenges of YA literature is that even though ostensibly it's intended for, in the case of teenage fiction, we should be writing it for teenagers. A lot of the people who decide whether a teenager will ever see it or not are adults, and a lot of a very large percentage of the consumers of young adult fantasy, especially, are actually adults in their 20s and 30s. And quite often, not always, but quite often, it's people who they kind of want fantasy, but they want it to be a little cozier, a little cleaner. They don't want the swearing. They want the sort of what they see as a kind of simplicity. But that in no way represents what most teenagers are going through or what they want to understand or see. And so there's always a tension. And also because, teenagers don't spend a lot of time on Twitter, most of the dialogue that publishers get exposed to around young adult fantasy, for example, is often just a whole bunch of adults talking to each other. And so that's why it's a very kind of a strange space. But in terms of, everything, this gets back to what I was sort of saying from the beginning. The truth is, I think for me as a writer, and I think for a lot of us just as people living in the world, doesn't it kind of feel like everything's just getting more restrictive? Like it just feels like every day we're hearing about like some new term or concept or story or book or whatever, or movie that has now suddenly become problematic. And it's very easy for us to go, oh, well, that's this horrible influence in society that's doing this. But one of the reasons I wanted to tell the story about the writing of Malevolent Seven is to tell the story of, actually, it turns out there was nobody censoring me, right? That was just me. People are entitled to go up on Twitter and say all kinds of things that I think are completely stupid. There's no obligation in me to act as if those people have a tremendous amount of power over me. And in fact, most of those people, I suspect, are working things out for themselves. And they don't necessarily need me to instantly sort of feel like I have to conform to it. And the funny thing is, partly because my wife is a librarian, but even in my own experience, I know what like actual censorship, that the censorship we need to concern ourselves with to some degree is structural. There's this thing that happened. There's two stories, one of which I'm not going to tell because it could get people in trouble in Russia. But the other was a few years ago. My publishers got a notice from, I believe it was the Arizona, but I apologize, Arizona, if it wasn't you and if it was Nevada, but I think it was the Arizona State Board of Corrections, informing them that my first novel, Traitor's Blade, was banned from the entire Arizona State Corrections system. So it could not be in any of the prison libraries, which seems like a very strange decision because it is a swashbuckling book. It's a fantasy novel that sort of harkens to the Three Musketeers. But I guess it was all the sword fighting. And so I'm not really one to rock the boat, and so I sent a note through my publishers. I emailed my publishers and said, please send this back to the Arizona State Board of Corrections. Again, if not you, Arizona, if it was you, Nevada, I apologize. It's going to turn out like the Arizona State Prison Board is like some bastion of free expression or something, and I'm going to really screw that up. I think it was either them or Nevada, one of those two southern states. Anyway, so I sent them a note saying, I received your notice. I understand. I'm really sorry about all the sword fighting. And if it makes you feel better, my next novel, How to Stage a Successful Prison Break, has no sword fights at all. And I never heard back from them, but I kind of hope they would like it. But the point of that is that there is real sort of censorship. And that censorship is often far more structural than we like to think. And that is this. And while it's totally fine for us to rail against the people on Twitter or social media or TikTok or wherever it is, we should first probably deal with the kind of structural censorship that we're risking the world. And so for me as an author, that's what I have to remind myself. The number one thing that most publishers, when you write something that might be deemed offensive in one form or another, will point it out to you and then say, do you want to fix this or not? And so in my case, they sometimes do that. I've never had them absolutely refuse. But then usually when remember that when somebody's offended by something, from the standpoint of like a person in society, you might go, well, I demand they not be offended by it. And, whatever, that's fine. But as a novelist, my problem is that if I write something that really hurts somebody's feelings or offends them, I'm taking them out of the story. And so that's what I'm always asking myself. Have I taken the reader to this place or use this word? Am I doing it in a way that is going to convey what I want to convey to them artistically, or am I distracting them from the story? So that's what happened. I'm sorry, you probably wanted an answer that was a little bit more tactical in terms of here's the things you can and can't do. Mostly the thing that you can't do is the same as in any part of the entertainment industry. You're just not allowed to be boring, which unfortunately I'm sometimes guilty of. And so, but every time you hear someone say, don't do this, nobody does this anymore. I was talking to a fellow author recently who was concerned about having a prologue in their book. Because they keep hearing that, oh, you can't put prologues in books anymore. Of course you can. It just has to be really good.
We have another question for you. What inspires your writing? Are there particular authors or a series or books that have influenced you over the years?
Yeah. I've spoken a little bit about kind of what informs my writing, which again, it's just, I always call it the gap, right? It's the gap between what I see out in the world, or what people are saying, and what I'm experiencing. When I was writing Trader's Blade, for example, which I mentioned because it was my debut novel, I was seeing all of this kind of cynicism and idealism, and I'm a very kind of classical, old school liberal. Like, I don't drink tea, I drink Diet Coke, but I'm like, the weak need tea drinking. Let's all kind of have a great long chat about it, sort of kind of person. And a lot of the ideals that I really believed in seemed like everyone was saying didn't matter anymore. And so I wrote a book about these swashbuckling, adventurers who are magistrates. They're traveling magistrates, and it's based on the 12th century itinerant justices in England, where you didn't have courts everywhere. You had to have what were called circuits, and these magistrates would ride from town to town over a very long circuit. And so you might go to a town and have to resolve a dispute that was 3 months old about whose cow ate whose grass. And so I wanted to write about them, but they start at the point at which this thing that they believed so strongly in has been proven almost completely false. This notion that if you try to bring justice to everyone, their lives will be better. And it seems like they're proven false. And so that's kind of what inspired me to write that. And that's usually what inspires me to write things. There's lots of authors, though, where I will be inspired by them. I loved Stephen Bruce was the first author who kind of taught me that you can write fantasy fiction without filling it full of these and thous and just archly formalist language. and he's deriving a certain amount, I think, from Roger Zelazny, who wrote Nine Princes in Amber, which is still a book I love to go back to now and then, who himself in some ways was following in the footsteps of the noir stylists like Raymond Chandler, wrote The Big Sleep. If you're a would-be writer and you want to figure out how to write with style and voice, just try some of those books, read The Big Sleep, see how a character walks into a room and how Philip Marlowe will describe what he sees, and you get a sense of voice from that. So I kind of take from everywhere. I'm a big Aaron Sorkin fan. He's a TV writer. He wrote The West Wing. You can see in some of my books tiny little homages to him. And of course, my love of swashbuckling comes through, not through the 30s where it should come from, or from centuries before that, but from The Princess Bride, which was the first sort of true swashbuckling movie I saw. And again, you can find little homages to The Princess Bride strewn throughout the Greatcoats.
We have another question. Do you prefer writing morally gray characters? It sounds like we have a writer in our midst. They say, I think they're so much fun because they can do what a villain can without repercussions.
That's an interesting take on it. Well, this is a good chance. See, this is why I love being in person, because then we could, really fight it out. So I don't think morally gray characters, for me, when they work, when I'm reading them, for example, I don't, as a reader, give them extra latitude to be inconsistent with whatever their moral framework is. So in that sense, I don't think they're any easier to write. So let me give you an example. If you have a character who you've decided is morally gray and therefore doesn't care about what happens to other people, but then you have a scene in the book where there's an elderly couple being chased down by some varlet or other, and then you sort of have your character get involved in that, then you now have a sort of an inconsistency that if we've seen them ignore other people's problems before, why are they ignoring them this time? And sometimes I see writers resort to this device about, I just decided to step in because I didn't like the look of that knight, who got in the way. And I always think, well, does that sound at all real? And so when you're writing morally gray characters, in fact, you have to be very careful, because you have to define a moral framework. Even though it feels amoral, it's still a framework, and therefore it's still a moral framework, regardless of whether they seem to not have the moral principles that we identify with being an ethical person. You have to kind of create that moral framework and then follow it through. So when I was writing Cade, who, in this book, people sort of say, it's funny, and the book gets described, the Malevolent Seven are all sort of defined as anti-heroes, in one way or another, but each of them has a very clear sort of moral framework that happens to be different from the others, and happens to be different from, let's say, Falcio Valmond in the Greatcoats, or Kellen or Farius there. Now, as far as your question about writing characters who can say and do whatever they want, that's when you want a squirrel cat. So when I wrote the Spellslinger series, this is where I discovered something really interesting. One of the things, this is sort of a connection between the Spellslinger series and Stephen Bruce. So Stephen Bruce wrote, I haven't got a copy of it right with me, but he wrote Jereg, which was the first novel of these Vlad Tepes books. They started in the 80s. They're still coming out. He just had a book named Salmoth that came out. He names his book after the creatures that represent the 17 houses in this world that he writes about. And he had a main character who is basically a kind of a lovable swashbuckling mob boss, who has a creature called the Jereg, which is a little tiny dragon. And the dragon calls him boss all the time. So he's like, they're coming around the corner, boss. And like a lot of familiars, his familiar is one that, adores him, will risk his life for him. And so when I was writing Spellslinger, I wanted Kellen not to have a familiar, but like a really horrible business partner, which is a squirrel cat, who basically, steals from him and will get him into trouble, and would, probably abandon him most times rather than risk himself. And so that kind of, and the thing that I discovered is that if you write a squirrel cat, a talking squirrel cat, they can say anything and get away with it. Like I would take a scene sometimes where I'd have a joke that was just a little on the edge, And if I gave that joke to a person, it would read as kind of unacceptable. And if I gave it to the squirrel cat, to Rikus, all of a sudden it's totally lovable. So when you want to write a character who can say and do awful things and get away with it, that's where you want a talking squirrel cat.
That makes sense. I have another question here. 7 characters is a lot. How do you keep so many characters straight and manage to give them all distinguishable voices?
Oh, that's a really great question. So I have a very particular way, I think, of writing characters. I'm not saying it's a unique way, but it's just the kind of the way that I tend to write. So as you notice from the reading, Cade was narrating. We were in the voice of, Cade, our main character. And what I'll tend to do, even when there's a large cast, is if I have a main character, everything that I create is meant to create problems for the main character. So if I have, for example, Falcio Valmond as a character who all he ever wanted to be was a sort of swashbuckling magistrate and make the world a more fair place, I put him in a country where nobody believes in that anymore, where it's very corrupt. The knights are bullies and thugs, and yet still admired and respected by the same people, the folk that Falcio tries to fight for, because as far as they're concerned, well, the knights, look like they're having a better time and they're, tough. And so, everything about his world challenges his own ideals. So when I'm creating characters, I'm always I create characters that are challenging for my main character. So as you might have noticed in the opening chapter of Malevolent Seven, Cade is kind of clearly troubled and cynical about these things that they're there to do. And who else do we have with him? We have Corrigan, who on the one hand is this big sort of brutish war mage who has no problem seemingly with the violence and destruction that they're doing, and would be the kind of person that Cade should be wanting to have die and get rid of to make the world a better place. And yet he can't, because it turns out that this guy who represents things that Cade is telling us he dislikes is also his friend, and also someone who actually cares about him. So each character, as we meet them in the story, it's not something that I think about sort of mechanistically as I'm writing, but that's the creative impulse I'm usually aiming for. It's, okay, we're about to meet a new character. Who will challenge Cade's viewpoint in the most interesting and dramatic way possible? Which is why, for example, we also see how cynical Cade is. And one of my favorite characters in the book is the character called Aridaeus Mosen, who we meet as this. He's handsome, he's this swashbuckler, he's incredibly compassionate and noble, and all the things that Cade thinks that a wondrous, like a mercenary mage, can't possibly be. And Aridaeus is a rat mage. So I wanted to play with the fact we usually think of, like, if we're going to call someone a rat mage, we would think that, oh, there must be awful and creepy, but he's like handsome and dashing and so kind, and just constantly talks about how noble rats are, and we should all admire them. And so that kind of a character, the one who seems like he's living this very heroic ideal, is just as challenging to Cade's sense of the world as Corrigan, who, acts like a brute and says, look, the world's an ugly place. You just have to get by as best you can. So you build your cast by creating characters that will challenge your main character. And if you do that, then they'll always feel like they have a purpose, and they'll always feel distinct from one another.
A commenter says, having chapter titles is a lost art, in my opinion. How do you come up with them? I've tried and tried, but I can never get them right.
Oh, well, there's a few different techniques. Yeah, I don't know why I did. So I put in chapter titles for a somewhat self-serving reason, which is that, so for example, I'll have a chapter that might be called Military and Discipline, or sometimes or the opening chapter. Openings are something I spend forever on, which is literally called, real mages don't wear funny hats. And so part of the reason why I do it is because as I'm writing the book, I need these units of story to be things I can glance at and go, right, that's what's happening there. Because the hardest thing about writing a novel is you're trying to balance all of these shifts, character shifts, things are going better for character or worse for character, but then there's external events and all this stuff. And so for me, chapter titles are a way of kind of diagrammatically putting the book into a state that I can sort of comprehend. One of the ways, so I will typically go, what's kind of the central thing in this chapter? What's the thing we notice, or what's a small detail that I think is really enjoyable? But mostly what I do is I try to go, imagine, if you try to make a symbol, right? Imagine, so think about like a company logo, where you go, okay, you have this company and it's got all these different things that it does and all these different people that work there and stuff. You have to reduce it to a single logo. What would that be? What's a sign for it? And so I sometimes think of a chapter title as, what's the symbol I want to represent what's happening in this chapter? Another technique you can use that I've seen used, it's a little trickier to use, and I did it in a book that an unpublished book. It's another screw you novel, as I call them. But I think I'm actually going to put that book out now, because now that I've done Malevolent Seven, I think that secretly any book I write that's not meant for anybody else is probably going to be one of my better books. But in that book, I try to make each chapter title a line of dialogue that somebody at some point delivers in the chapter. But you have to be very careful, because it can't be a line of dialogue that spoils anything. But that's one way to do it. But typically just ask yourself, like, what's an interesting detail about this chapter? And then sometimes you can also get to a point where you have different, where a group of chapters have different titles, but with the same structure. And then sometimes that's kind of a fun way to play. I just like to play with story in every part of a book. So one of the weird things about me is that all my books have these acknowledgements that are incredibly convoluted, like where I'll like reveal different parts of, for example, the acknowledgements for Malevolent Seven is the only place in the book where the 12 major magic systems are described. And so I'll describe a magic system, and then some of the people that I'm acknowledging who helped make the book happen, I fit them into that, because I just want everything to be part of the story. So that's a fun way to do that. I recommend that. And then it's just another way to kind of bring story to the forefront and just to have fun as an author.
That makes sense. You have talked about how this book wasn't planned and was written for yourself, but do you normally plan your books? And how do you organize that? Do you sit down and create a detailed outline?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There's a lot of parlance around the craft of writing these days, and of course, one of the most common one is plotter or pantser, which I guess is meant to mean someone who plots out a book before writing it, and someone who writes by the seat of their pants. And I think I'm a prospector. I go digging. And like any kind of prospector, I'll just keep going digging anywhere. And so sometimes I'll go, you know what, I'm going to try to write an outline for this book. And I'll try to write an outline. But really, what is that process? Writing an outline it's just looking for gold, right? It's looking for something great. I'm going, okay, if I outline this and I do all this, oh, that's really great, right? Other times I'll go, no, I just got to throw myself in and write. And I'm just writing, and I'm writing in search of something, that I really like. And over time, I slowly put it together. And depending on the book, I will frequently go from I had an outline to I started writing, the outline fell apart literally on page one, to I'm a third of the way through the book. I start making weird diagrams. I've made like Excel spreadsheets. None of this stuff ever survives the drafting process, but all of it serves to just give me one more crack, like one more angle to try to find some veins of gold that I can, use to slowly put together this book. The closest thing to a formal writing process that I have, and I only bring this up because I think maybe it's helpful for some people to give it a try, is that my favorite way to write a book is to write a novel. It's to write a draft in 1 month. Which is very hard for a lot of people. It's certainly hard if you're not a full-time novelist, but sometimes it's doable. I'm not talking about the NaNoWriMo sort of process, because while I think that's perfectly fine and wonderful for people, I don't like the notion of just write crap and you'll fix it later. That doesn't work for me. I want to write something that I believe in, that I like. But if I write a novel over the course of a month, it allows me to basically live the story. And so, because I tend to write in 4 acts, and really, look, in fiction, for the most part, contemporary fiction is in 4 acts. And the reason I say that is because people who say it's in 3 acts will say there's a first act and there's a third act, and the second act is twice the length of the first and third act, and it has a midpoint that separates it in the middle. Well, to me, that sounds like, 4 acts. But what's great about that is that means there's 4 weeks in a typical month, which means that I can kind of make myself feel like, all right, it's Monday morning. I got to be starting a new act. I'm starting something new, which allows me to kind of create that sense of a shift in the story. And as we get to, Wednesday, I'm like, all right, well, I better be into the heart of the conflict here. And as I get to, Friday, Saturday, I'm like, well, I got to hit the climax of this act here. And then, Sunday, it's got to wrap that act up and set up for the next one. And then because there's always, or almost always, more than 4 weeks in a month, with the exception of February 2020, when I wrote the Malevolent Seven, then I have a couple of days at the end to write epilogues, because I really like spending a little bit of time in epilogues. And so I really like that rhythm of just, because my brain, my body knows where I am in the week, which then allows me to go, okay, well, my story needs to sort of be there too. There's a limit to what you can do with that. Like, I can write a 90,000 word draft in a month pretty easily, but of course, some of the Greatcoats novels are 185,000 words, and of course, Brandon Sanderson writes 250,000 word books regularly. It probably doesn't work so well for that. But actually, even with longer ones, I find if I can get that core story kind of explored and put together in a month, then everything is just so much easier for me. And in fact, I've been shocked when I wrote Fate of the Argosy, which is one of my favorite books. I wrote that entirely in a month, and I just assumed that my publisher was going to be like, okay, well, this is an okay first draft. And I sent it to my editor and said, I don't need you to tell me what's wrong with this. Just tell me the parts you like, because I'm throwing everything else away before I start up again. And I was shocked. He wrote me back after a week or two, and he said, I love this novel. Like, I don't want to change anything. And so I only had to do a very light edit on it. And I think that part of that was that it really suited that life. So that's the process. When I get to do it that way, I'm really happy. And when I don't, there's a book I'm working on called Our Lady of Blades. It's going to be one of, if not the best book I've ever written. It's by far the most challenging. I've taken, I think, 13 runs at this book now, and every time I'll end up crashing. And because I didn't kind of get through it the first time, it means I'm constantly hitting walls, and I'll move it a little bit farther forward. And so I often encourage people, like, especially when you're starting out, you need to just get to the end. You're going through a dark forest. The point is not to win like a foot race through it. The point is to get to the other side before you run out of steam. And once you've done that and you've got that story, all of the problems become fixable. So that's when I can do it, I write it that way. And then I don't know, it's so satisfying too. I don't know why. I just, it's like it's the last day of the month, and I can say to my wife, like, we can celebrate. I just finished a novel.
Well, I'm sure I speak for a few of us when I say we can't wait to see how that turns out when you've got it ready. Another question, how did you feel being blurbed by the director of John Wick?
That was really fun, actually. I got lucky, and I got to meet Chad Stahelski a while back for things I can't really talk about too much, but the first thing he said to me when we met was he said it was like April, I think 2 years ago or last year or 2 years ago, probably last year. And he said, hey, so listen, since January, I've read every single thing you've ever written twice. And I was like, how is that possible? But he knew he knew everything I'd written, and he understood it on a level that it was like you can't imagine how nice it is when you have someone with that level of talent and success it's not just that they, have nice things to say about your work, but actually like get it on that deep level. And he's such a smart guy. Like, a lot of people don't realize this, but if you watch the sort of John Wick movies, and you can have different people have different responses to it, it's very hard to write story inside of action. I used to be a fight choreographer for the theater, so I would choreograph sword fights for the theater. And like a typical Shakespeare play might go, brilliant dialogue, brilliant dialogue, brilliant dialogue, and then they fight. And then there's not, and then it's like, such and such a character dies, Mercutio dies. And so there's nothing in there to support you. But if you just throw like two actors just doing a bunch of sword fighting moves, it just looks like nonsense, right? And so you have to find a way to tell a story within that. And one of the things that Chad Stahelski does that I really, really admire is he makes every single one of those fights a story. And you can watch it, and even if there's no line of dialogue, you can feel where Keanu Reeves is at and what's going on through his head and what the conflict is and what this fight is proving. So I quite love that. But when we had been for various reasons discussing sort of Malevolent Seven, and I thought, I knew he had John Wick 4 was coming out, and I was like, I just know this thing's going to be a huge success, and that's the last time I'm ever going to get to talk to him. So I said to my agent, hey, do me a favor, just ask if he's got a minute, if he could, blurb the book. And so he was kind enough to do so. And then I told, this is a terrible thing to tell people. So I may or may not get in trouble for this, but I told my publishers, like, yeah, this is the quote. I want his quote on the cover of the book, because that way people will see the quote and they'll think, oh God, is this thing going to become a movie from the John Wick guy? And so sure enough, like I've had that question a bunch of times. So there's my new cunning tactic.
So your history as a fight choreographer, I imagine, has informed some of your writing. And I noticed that you've had many career paths. Are there any other jobs or instances that you experienced in those jobs that have touched your writing of this book?
Yeah, it's funny. The good thing about being a novelist is that every single career you've ever had, of whatever kind, however glorious or despicable, will find its way into your work. It's one of the things it's one of the only jobs where getting older is sort of an advantage, right? When you're young, you still have lots of things to say, so that's cool. But as you get older, you find even more stuff to say, like more things that affect you. And so, for example, the fight choreography played a role not just in writing fight scenes, but in having a sense of what those spaces needed to be. But I've been a musician for a long time, and so I use music often as a way to get a sense of rhythm. So if I have a scene, I'll sometimes kind of, when I go running, I'll listen to a song sort of on repeat, where I'll go, this song has the rhythm that I want for this scene, which then means that my prose will actually have kind of a cadence that will almost match to it. And that works out really well for me. But in the case of Malevolent Seven, part of it's also just having been in so many bands. And the thing about bands is that bands of musicians are kind of like bands of war mages and mercenaries, because everybody's a little strange, everybody's a little broken, everybody's coming from a somewhat different kind of moral perspective about the world, but you all kind of have to make it work together, and you have to have, even if you're not friends, once you get on stage and start playing, you have to have a kind of friendship that is really, really deep if you want the music to sort of feel genuine. And so that's why I think I kind of love writing about groups and bands of people. And it's funny, a good friend of mine, Nicholas Eames, who wrote, Kings of the Wild, he very intentionally was writing about, a band of adventurers as a parallel for a band of musicians and stuff. But I don't think Nick's ever been in a band, so I should sue him for that. That was inappropriate. He should not have written about that.
It looks like we're at the hour here, so I've got a comment and a final question for you. I will give you the comment first. Not a question so much as a comment. Just wanted to say thank you, and that this has been very entertaining, and I hope you can physically come to Saskatoon sometime.
I would love to. I actually want to this time, but timing wasn't looking viable. But yes, I've only once been to Saskatchewan. it was in Regina, and I was playing 2 nights at a dinner theater in a ABBA tribute band. And that was, yeah, and that was a few years ago. And I had to learn all these ABBA songs on guitar. And they were lovely people to play with, so that was good fun. But yeah, that was, and it was February, which was almost you should really have like a policy that says tourists are never allowed to come to Saskatchewan in February on their first visit. On the second visit, sure, but not on the first visit, because it's really shocking when you come from BC.
I bet. I am very sad to have missed this ABBA act. Hopefully you will bring that back and come here with it.
Sure.
The final question is, how do you decide when your book is done? Do you just write, or do you go back and edit as you write?
I've done both. I do both. My process, if I'm trying to write a book over the course of a month, so if you were to see the first draft of Malevolent Seven, which the final book is probably about 105,000 words, and the first draft is probably about 65,000 words, which would make it seem like, wow, the second draft must have been like just a ton of work, but it really isn't. Like, that's what I mean about like getting through that sort of cycle. But the way that I most like to write is if I get up first thing in the morning and write a couple of chapters. If I write like 3,000 words, let's say, which I guess is about what, 12 pages, I guess, if we're thinking those terms, something like that. But if I write like, 3,000 to 5,000 words, and then in the afternoon, then I because my publishers, both my World Rights publishers are based in the UK, all my email and stuff has to be done fairly early in the morning. Otherwise, I lose them for another day. So I'll go do that kind of stuff. And then in the afternoon, I'll basically just rewrite those chapters. Like I'll put what I wrote up on the screen, have a new file next to me, and I just retype everything, because that allows me to find better rhythms and correct mistakes. And most often find things where I'm like, I didn't really describe this character very well, or there's a more lyrical way to handle this dialogue. And that feels for me really good, because when I go to bed at night, it means I've created something that I like, right? I didn't just blurt something out. The morning is for blurting it out. The morning is for hitting your pickaxe against the wall and getting until you find some gold. And then the afternoon is for just extracting just the gold. And then I find that really works. However, that will only work if you are someone who can then the next day go back into the mine and start, hitting it with the pickaxe again. The scariest thing for me when I'm writing a novel, when I'm writing a draft in a month, and not, as I say, not all books, Play of Shadows, which comes out next year, which is the first book in the Court of Shadows, which is the first of the new Greatcoats books. That book went through 12 drafts. It had 9 drafts before I decided to write it in first person. So everything's going to be different. But the scariest part for me, if I'm writing a draft in a month, is a day where I that night I go, you know what, those chapters, they're not actually working. I need to rewrite them again, because that's where I can get into the death spiral of rewriting and rewriting and rewriting. But so far, I find, again, because I have that rhythm, I have that week, I'm like, it's Thursday, like, yeah, okay, I can rewrite it, but I got to get moving. It sort of works for me. So that's usually how I do it.
Good. Well, thank you so much for sharing your evening with us. And thank you to Amanda and Mobius Books for making this event possible. I'll just mention for our audience that we, of course, have copies of the Malevolent Seven for sale. We have a limited number of bookmarks, mage card sets, and which Malevolent Seven mage are you quizzes to give you when you purchase the book, courtesy of Mobius. Got some here. We may even still have a small number of signed copies of the book, so please don't hesitate to visit us at mcnallyrobinson.com or give us a call at 306-955-3599 to reserve yours. Thank you again, Sebastien, and thank you to our audience. Have a
Thanks,
wonderful
everyone.
evening.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.